I would say definitely they take a maximalist view of the letters that can be read. And that, for me, was a bit of a red flag to see. I mean, not just in Sinai 357, in many of these other inscriptions, letters that no one has proposed are there. No one has even considered the possibility that there are letters. And I think it just becomes, as you said, a Rorschach test.
Have scholars found the signature of Moses? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, we are turning to the topic that is everywhere in the news right now, the alleged discovery of a signature, an inscription, a reference to Moses at Serabit El-Khadim. We are going to have a conversation with Dr. Aren Wilson-Wright, a specialist in these inscriptions, to see what is what in the claims of Michael Baron. We are going to be sifting through some of the background, some of the historical scholarship, and then some of the new arguments that are being proposed, so you can see where things stand up, where you should have questions, what red flags should be waving in your mind, and where you should leave thinking about these inscriptions and what they mean for us. Remember, for early access to ad-free video podcasts and exclusive bonus content, like a weekly bonus podcast and additional clips with guests, you can join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. We hope to see you there. But for right now, settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about the alleged discovery of a signature of Moses. Dr. Aren Wilson-Wright, thank you so much for taking the time today to come and talk about a currently very popular topic on the internet, potential alleged inscription reference to the one and the only Moses. So thank you for coming in to share your perspectives and your insight on this topic.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jordan.
Can we start at the very beginning here before we jump into some of the new claims? I think it would be helpful for the audience to frame some of where and when we're talking about, because a lot of the coverage jumps immediately, into the sensationalism to say, well, this is what they're saying is here, but lacks the background of where this place is and the setting of this, which I think is really important for framing readings of these. So could we start there?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two sets of inscriptions that get discussed in Baron's work. There's those from Serabit El-Khadim, which is an Egyptian turquoise mining facility in the Sinai Peninsula. And then there are two from Wadi el-Hol, which is a military road. There's this bend in the Nile near the first cataract, known as the Kenna Bend of the Nile. And rather than, taking a boat around this, curving bit of the Nile, there's like a road that connects the straighter parts of it. That would be used particularly for, military expeditions to move a little bit faster, but was also used by sort of people like taking a picnic or like a day to walk around. We have some Egyptian inscriptions there that are just like, oh, spending the day here, things like that. So that's very interesting. Serabit El-Khadim, we have many more of the alphabetic inscriptions from there. We only have two from Wadi el-Hol. Serabit El-Khadim, maybe about 40, 45 or so alphabetic inscriptions, depending on how you count them, whether or not you count some that only have a few letters or are broken, as well as hundreds of Egyptian inscriptions from the site as well. There's also a temple to the Egyptian goddess Hathor there. She's the patron deity of turquoise and turquoise mining, so it was very important to have this temple at the site. And the Egyptian inscriptions from Serabit El-Khadim and its environs kind of span the Old Kingdom to the New Kingdom, with a big concentration of inscriptions from the Middle Kingdom, and particularly the reigns of Amenemhat III and Amenemhat IV.
And for a sense of like dating for someone who's thinking, I know I've heard these terms before, when are we talking about within those periods?
Yeah, so for the Middle Kingdom, this would be like 19th century to 18th century BCE, approximately when you see kind of the greatest number of, or the largest amount of Egyptian activity at the site, in terms of the inscriptions that get left behind. And the Egyptian inscriptions are particularly important for understanding the alphabetic inscriptions, in that they provide some context for the activities that were being performed at Serabit El-Khadim. So as you can imagine, it's a turquoise mine. There's a lot of turquoise mining going on. And these inscriptions are left by, the leaders of these royal expeditions that are being sent by the pharaoh to go get turquoise and then bring it back to the Egyptian heartland. And many of the inscriptions are left by, high-ranking officials within the expedition leader, other high officials that are affiliated with the expedition. They're often very braggadocious. They're like, I brought back more turquoise than anyone before me.
My trip was the most successful of all.
Exactly. No one died. No one got sick on my trip to Serabit El-Khadim, nothing like that. So they're very braggadocious, but interestingly enough, they often include lists of the expedition members. So here's like the high officials. They like have like, here are the donkey drivers, here are like the miners. They don't like list their names usually, but they'll say like, oh, we had 30 donkey drivers and 600 miners or something like that. So they give an idea of like the composition of these expeditions. And what's particularly interesting in the inscriptions from the reigns of Amenemhat III and Amenemhat IV is that they mention two groups of people, two sort of, in the Egyptian language, these would be considered like ethnicities. So they're the Amu, which is the Egyptian name for people kind of from the Levant, and then the Rechenu. And these are people probably from like further north, like up in Syria. And it mentions their participation in these expeditions. So it'll say like, 6 Amu or 10 Rechenu or things like that. And during the reign of Amenemhat III, we actually have references to this figure known as an Egyptian Khebded or Khebdedem. It's probably like Semitic name, Habidadum or something like that, who's called the brother of the Prince of Rechenu. So he seems to be a pretty high-ranking Semitic official that's present at Serabit El-Khadim. And he even commissions his own hieroglyphic stela. It's like not necessarily the same quality as the stelas that are left by the expedition leaders, but he has kind of the means and the status to have something done in hieroglyphics. And there's even...
But it exists nonetheless. It's still
exactly
there. So there's a lot of context within the inscriptions from their immediate environment that does give us historically some insight into the readings of these and I guess the dynamics that led to their creation, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, and I guess as adding in the background here, it's also worth saying that these are not newly found inscriptions.
No.
So can you say a little bit too about, I guess we have some of the historical background for when they emerged in antiquity. Can we talk a little bit too of when they emerged into, I guess, the academic space for the considerations of study? Because this new claim is not the first, endeavor to look at these, and it's also not entirely new in what it's claiming either. So can you give a kind of the quick SparkNotes overview there? I guess that's a lot to go through, but some of how academics have dealt with these in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. The first couple inscriptions are discovered in 1904, 1905. The famous Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie discovers these while excavating the temple at Serabit El-Khadim. And what does he call them? It's like a foreign alphabet or like a strange alphabet. He doesn't quite, or maybe even calls it a writing system. He doesn't connect it to alphabetic writing.
Okay.
Initially. And it's not until 1916 with the publication of Alan Gardner's work on these alphabetic inscriptions that he says, I think these are alphabetic. I can actually read a little bit of them. So he reads the word Ba'alat, the lady, which corresponds to what we have in the Egyptian inscriptions. They're always saying oh, beloved of Hathor, lady of turquoise, every single Egyptian inscription, sometimes multiple times. So he says, well, we've got the word, the lady here. This would kind of fit with what we see in the Egyptian inscriptions. And there is a sort of pseudo-bilingual inscription, which is Sinai 345, the famous Sphinx, that has both alphabetic and hieroglyphic writing on it. They're not exact translations of each other, but the hieroglyphic text says, beloved of Hathor. The word lady is missing, and then turquoise. So presumably meant to say beloved of Hathor, lady of turquoise, and then one of the alphabetic inscriptions says beloved of the lady. So I think we can be pretty secure in our readings of these inscriptions, at least the basics.
Okay.
Yeah, and then over time there have been many other expeditions, both sort of official and unofficial, to Serabit El-Khadim. Every single one, or almost every single one, seems to turn up new inscriptions. So there's like quite a lot of alphabetic texts there. They really, I think after Gardner's 1916 article, that's like kind of really when it starts to snowball in terms of the study of them. Already in 1923, we get a book-length treatment by Hubert Grimme, and he's making sort of similar claims to what we see today, that these texts mention Moses and are relevant for the Exodus. So already very early in the history of scholarship, these texts are connected to the Hebrew Bible and the story of the Exodus.
So this is, in a way, a return to some older forms of study. But I guess within that, if those claims have already been made, not recently, a ways back, how have those been, I guess, dealt with by the scholarly community from kind of those claims in the 1920s until now? Are those readings seen, right, historically as, I'm assuming here, given that they're not the dominant reading of these, inferior in some ways or having some weaknesses?
Yeah, they definitely have weaknesses. And I would also say, this is not a phenomenon that's isolated to the 1920s. We also get similar readings like in the 1980s with William Shea. There's the fairly recent book by Douglas Petrovich from 2016. There's an article by Charles Kramalkov, all making sort of similar claims connecting these to the Israelites, to the Exodus, to Moses. So there is kind of this long minority tradition of connecting these texts to the Hebrew Bible that has not generally been well accepted sort of in the general scholarly community.
Is there something, I guess, specific about these? Is it just the fact that these inscriptions exist and that they're in a geographic location that would be nice and that leads to a through line kind of between some of these claims? Or is there something different that they all seem to be turning to and wanting to establish a historicity for Moses?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, the location is quite nice, I guess, if you want to say, yes, these have something to do with Moses. They're in the Sinai. One could potentially, as many of these scholars have done, construct some sort of narrative that places, the revelation at Sinai near Serabit El-Khadim, or says, this is part of the desert sojourn, things like that. The other facet of these inscriptions that I think has attracted a lot of attention from people who want to see these texts as related to the Hebrew Bible, as related to Moses, is in, I think, 5, if not more, of these inscriptions. We have the sequence of letters, Mem, Shin. We'll talk more about whether or not it's actually a Shin when we get to the linguistic aspects of them.
Yes.
But like 5 or more times we have M, Shin, and this has sort of been a magnet to people saying, oh, this is Moses, right? This is Moshe. But yeah, there are problems with that. There are linguistic problems with that. There are, historical contextual problems with that. There are, sometimes even epigraphic problems with that that have led to these theories, I think, not gaining widespread acceptance.
Okay, so can we then turn, I guess, to the more recent claims at hand, those of Bar-On, in what they have called a proto-paper, right? And this is not, I guess, if you're listening through this and you're like, I've only kind of seen this floating around. This isn't something that's been officially published. This hasn't gone through peer review. This is something that they have put out for consideration and has, because of some of its claims, I think made a lot of waves in specific communities and then garnered attention because it's Moses. And they say things like, is this a signature of Moses? There's a quote that they have that I want to read before we jump into this, that they say, I'm compelled to propose that the inscriptions could well have been written by a historical base personage found behind the biblical tradition of Moses. So within this reading, they don't shy away from putting forward some reasons behind their interpretation. Could you go through, I guess, in your view of their claim and where they sit within some of the historic readings of this, what exactly stood out to you about what Barone is claiming? And could you explain, I guess, some of the immediate flags that should stand up in someone's mind when they are seeing this type of work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say in terms of what struck me as kind of unique about this new proposal, I mentioned the 5 texts that seem to have M Shin in them. They don't actually look at those texts. They're looking at completely different parts of the inscriptions to find Moses in them. So that already kind of struck me as a little bit strange or interesting.
Yeah, that is weird. Is there any reason why? Because I guess I didn't really register that as I was reading through their thing, that they don't spend time with those ones.
No, I don't know. I'm not sure. It's a little bit strange to me, and then we can talk about that more when we look at Sinai 361, where, well, I mean, I won't spoil it, but we'll get to that. So that struck me as a bit interesting, a bit unique for these claims. And then the other one that I thought was interesting is the dating of the text. So sort of I'd say that currently the consensus dating is to place these in like the 19th century BCE. There are some minority views that would place it maybe in the 15th century in the New Kingdom. There's one scholar who puts it even in the 13th century. But I think there are good reasons to see these as from the 19th century, particularly the mention of so many, people from Syria, Palestine in the Egyptian inscriptions. Like, we see the largest number of those mentions in the Egyptian inscriptions from the 19th century, not so much in the New Kingdom. And I don't even know if Serabit El-Khadim is functioning as a mining site in the 13th century. So, I think, consensus seems to be 19th century, good reasons for that. 15th century, maybe. 13th century, I think, is a little bit beyond the pale, personally. But regardless, a lot of times when people are connecting these texts to the Exodus, they're accepting the 15th century date.
Right.
This plays a lot better with, reconstructions are, reconstructions is sort of a historical kernel of the Exodus happening, either under Ramses II or Tutmosis III, datings like that. And those play pretty nicely together. If this is, 15th century and, the pharaoh of the Exodus is Tutmosis III, maybe, right? Like, those align very nicely. The issue, I think, is if you're going to take these texts as being from the 19th century, this creates a massive problem with chronology. And I know that Barone adheres to, I think, what they call the high chronology, which shifts everything back. And I see that kind of as problematic because it necessitates a sort of wholesale reevaluation of the chronology and of many different historical events. And just like, it's a big ask for like the data that's being presented.
And they don't really get into, they kind of make some throwaway lines that, I'm going to date this at this time period in accordance with my view, and it doesn't create a problem, but I'm not going to unpack that here, and let's just happily move along and act like that doesn't create significant problems for how these things are lining up. And that also seemed a little bit confused at other times where they want to propose some of that, 19th, 18th century, but then also make references to the early Hyksos period for some other things. And like the consistency felt like it was lacking at some times, and maybe not so much of a concern. Did it feel like that was like the dating of these things feels like an important part of a through line in establishing your reading? Did it feel like that was a part that fell off of the table for them?
Yeah, it felt like there was a little bit of a slippage because there was talk of 12th dynasty and then later 13th dynasty. I'm like, well, which is it? Is it 12th dynasty or 13th dynasty? I mean, there's like 100 years at least between these different dates. And, it's potentially problematic for any sort of historical reconstruction to not be as specific as possible.
And I guess if we tag that directly into the linguistic methods, because as we're talking about the chronology of things, those conversations can often go hand in hand as they're developing, which is something they turn to in some phrases to say, well, this letter type might look out of place, but I'm proposing that if Moses existed and was trained in an old scribal system, they'll be holding on to that. So if we turn to some of these linguistic concerns, how did that side of their argument seem to fit in? Are they bringing a traditional approach to their study of these texts and the letters that they're identifying? Are they trying to forge a new path? Are they somewhere in between?
Yeah, I would say they are kind of in line with this tradition going back to Grimme of seeing these as, Grimme calls them Alt Hebräisch, old Hebrew. So that these are sort of like an old form of Hebrew, an older form of what we see in the Hebrew Bible.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that, I don't remember off the top of my head whether sort of Grimme addresses, the chronological gap between the text of the Hebrew Bible and these texts from Serabit El-Khadim. I know particularly Bar-On and also Douglas Petrovich basically read these texts as if they are biblical Hebrew with maybe a couple minor tweaks.
Yeah.
And this really raises a lot of red flags for me. The oldest, securely dated Hebrew text is, maybe 900 BCE. If these are from the reign of Amenemhat, this is like 900 years earlier. We would expect at least some change, I think, from 1800 to 900 BCE in the language. So we'd expect, older forms, changes in the language. And Bar-On addresses this partially by saying, well, it's this very sacred liturgical language. It doesn't.
It's not going to change. It's going to be so traditionally held that we shouldn't expect things to shift.
Yeah, and as a sort of counterpoint to that, I would say, in the Hebrew Bible, from early texts like we have, in, say, Genesis or Exodus or Samuel Kings versus what we have in Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, like we see an evolution already in that time span. And that's, a shorter time span than what would separate the earliest Hebrew that we have from the inscriptions from Serabit El-Khadim. So like if we have a fairly large evolution in Hebrew just in that short time span, which I think also indicates that it is not necessarily this like sort of sacred fossilized language that Bar-On claims it is. Like, I think by analogy, we would expect to see at least some change from 19th or 18th century to like the 10th century.
Yeah, that part was an odd, you've heard the claim before of like, the reverence for this is going to mean it stays, and it fit with some of their claims regarding how they see Moses. But they also, another one that I wanted to hear your thoughts on when they're talking about the connection to Moses and some of the development of this writing, they said, Moses, to whom Israel's founding national writings are traditionally attributed, would be just such a first emperor when they're talking about some potential shifts in the language for this nation. And while he would have begun standardizing the written language up to and through the period of his rulership, variant forms of Proto-Sinaitic would have been common. So he does like this weird, there are going to be some maybe variances in my forms, but Moses is doing this like period of standardization, which then is going to be held by everyone because of the reverence for the text and the reverence of Moses, despite the fact that, within the text itself, we are going to see changes. And all of these pieces just feel like they're kind of, I don't want to deal. I'm not going to acknowledge them. Like not even a disclaimer to say, here's someone who might disagree with me. Like that part's just not even present.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, a charitable reading would be that like we have this writing system that predates Moses in Bar-On's reconstruction. There is some variability in it. Then Moses, as the lawgiver, kind of standardizes it. And then I guess both the language, well, it can't be the script because the script obviously changes. I guess the language. So like, because an important thing I think here is to make a distinction between script and language. I think there's
Yes.
also slippage between those two things as well in Baron's proto-thesis.
Can you say a little bit about that? Because I also feel like because there's some, as you said, slippage, then in coverage and discussion, depending on who's kind of picking up this thing, that gap or confusion has just continued to be amplified in a space where I think there's already some maybe confusion among public people. Like, well, what's the difference between how are we seeing things? So can you say a little bit there? Because I do think that's an important point of distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the script, I mean, this would be like the letter forms, the shapes that they take, the sounds that they express, obviously related then to how that script encodes the language, but distinct from it, right? Like, because you can have, like, for example, English is written in the Latin alphabet, but it is not itself Latin, right? The Latin alphabet can be used to write a variety of different languages, but that doesn't mean that they're all Latin.
Mm-hmm.
Or, Arabic is used to write Persian as well, but these are separate languages as well. So there is a distinction between script and language that I think is important to talk about here. And this is where we sort of see some slippage, I think, in that the assumption that these inscriptions encode biblical Hebrew leads to certain interpretations of the letters that go against, I think, the more common view of how the letters work in these texts.
Mm-hmm.
So, biblical Hebrew has 22 consonants. Interestingly enough, like, it actually has more sounds than those 22. We see in the Masoretic text, right, there's the sin, shin distinction. You use the dot to distinguish those. There's also the famous case of, right, Gaza,
Mm-hmm.
written with an ein in the Masoretic text, indicating that probably it was originally pronounced Gaza as opposed to Aza. So, like, there are other sounds that are sort of lurking behind the Hebrew writing system that are disguised by the fact that the Israelites adopted the Phoenician writing system. When we get to, like, the Serabit El-Khadim inscriptions, we have more than 22 distinct characters, which would suggest, perhaps, I mean, at this very early stage of the development of the alphabet, that we have more than 22 phonemes in the language, more than 22 sounds. And because Baron is saying this is Hebrew, and specifically, a Masoretic form of Hebrew, not taking into account sort of the historical linguistics of Hebrew, that Hebrew originally had more than just the 22 sounds represented by the 22 letters, it kind of forces them to say, like, oh, actually, like, we have multiple letters for the same sound.
Yeah.
Which then, creates problems, because it creates some leeway to sort of massage the text in a certain direction or another, right? Like, if multiple letters can represent the same sound, then, you can change how, like, things work.
You can make it fit the need that you have, which we see in their reading of 357.
Yes, exactly.
In their trying to bring together the inscription that is traditionally recognized, that longer vertical one, and where they are proposing the inscription in a reference to Moses, and they do some of this, I guess, linguistic massaging in wanting to identify characters between the two of those. So could I ask about that one in particular? Because I think 357 has been one that has floated around because of some of the photos that are put forward. In your assessment of his reading of that inscription and the way it has been put forward, I guess similarly returning to how does this feel like it stacks up for you? Are there areas of problem, weakness, red flags that come to the front that the readers, the listeners should be like, I should have some questions about the way you're presenting your argument here?
Yeah, I would say probably the biggest red flag, particularly for the reading of, like, this is from Moses off to the side of the L-shaped inscription, is we get, their drawing of the letters that they see there. We don't really get a close-up of that section of the inscription without the letters.
No.
Which, like, part of that, I think, is kind of like priming, right? Like if you see the letters drawn out and then you like look, then you'll be like, yes, of course that's the case. But if you look at photos of this inscription without the letters drawn, there really isn't a whole lot there. The eth or the zayin and the tav are maybe there. They're very small compared to the other letters in the vertical and horizontal inscriptions.
Mm-hmm.
They're also pretty simple letters. They just consist of 2 strokes. This could be, potentially accidental. We actually see, I'll send a photo of the inscription for you to include with this episode. If you look at the top of the inscription in the photo that I'll send, there are these large gouge marks that are thicker than the lines that we see in the inscription. And Sinai 357 is found within one of the turquoise mines. And these gouge marks are probably tool marks as the miners are hacking off pieces of the wall to then take out of the mine and crush and try and extract the turquoise from. So on that rock wall that the inscription is incised upon, there are actually just a lot of stray marks. And the zayin and the tav, different scholars have different opinions on whether those are deliberate or accidental. I'm not actually sure. I've not come down one way or another myself. But the 3 letters that Bar-On reads below, the mem, mem, shin, are not really there. I mean, there's maybe a couple diagonal strokes that could be the edge of a mem, but they're very thick and they're very reminiscent of the tool marks that we see up top and on the flat surface of the wall. So they, in my opinion, are just stray tool marks that are left from the mining operations.
Which feels like when you remove, as they have done, the inscriptions from their context, the setting that they're in, the physical activity that's around them. These aren't just inscriptions on any regular wall that's nice and smooth and there's nothing else present.
Exactly.
If you take that away, then the Rorschach test of is this a thing or is this not a thing can shift because, well, I'm not looking for pick marks anymore or stray activities or crack in the rock that has changed over time. Everything must be a thing.
Yes.
Which can be amplified when, you don't give the same type of close-up photo of both. And they give a description of the color system that they're going to use, where some of these are the ones that everyone can read and some are from high res and some are the ones that I'm proposing. But those color marks don't stay consistent through the whole thing either. And so you're looking at it and I have this page open on one side with the description and the photo. And I'm like, but this isn't any of those colors. So I don't know what you're doing with this part, and I can't see what's behind it anyways, and I don't know where to go with this now.
Yeah, I would say definitely sort of they take a maximalist view of the letters that can be read on these inscriptions. And that, for me, was a bit of a red flag to see, readings of a bunch of, not just in Sinai 357, in many of these other inscriptions, letters that no one has proposed are there. No one has even considered the possibility that there are letters, in particular parts of the inscriptions. And I think it just becomes, as you said, a Rorschach test, right? These are not, really elite style inscriptions. These are most likely produced by the miners themselves, using the tools that they had, using the resources they had. They're not, smoothing the sandstone in a really they're not taking the time to smooth the sandstone down nice and flat. So there are a lot of the surface is rough, in certain light angles this can cast shadows which can end up looking like letters, sort of. It depends on the resolution of the photo, of course. There are early inscriptions from 1932 from the Catholic scholar Boutin, who published an edition of the inscriptions that I think then were digitized. They were put on Inscriptifact. They were very high quality for 1932, maybe a little bit less high quality, now that we have digital photography and things like that. So there, you do sort of get in interpretations that are based on those photos, there are a couple cases of people reading, oh, like a shadow that's cast by like a irregular part of the rock surface, or like a tool mark, because they're black and white. It's a little bit, there's sort of a whole epistemology when it comes to reading inscriptional texts that I think, doesn't get talked about enough. It's like, how do I know that what I'm seeing is like a deliberate mark as opposed to a stray tool mark, as opposed to like a shadow cast by like an irregularity on the surface of the stone? And I think that's something that, as epigraphers, we really need to sort of engage in and talk about more about like why we think something is a tool mark or a shadow or a deliberate. How can we distinguish these things? And I think in the case of Sinai 357, like you can distinguish the deliberate marks from the tool marks in terms of like the width of the stroke. And you can see like, oh, up here, like where they've been carving out bits of sandstone to then crush turquoise out of, like these are much wider than the deliberate incisions that make up the widely accepted letters. And so we should, if we have a stroke that's very wide, I mean, these are maybe like 3 times as wide as the deliberate strokes, and also have sort of a different texture, a different color when you look at them in a color photograph, like they seem very distinct from the deliberate marks. So like having a way to distinguish, having a way to argue for saying like, I think this is a deliberate mark. This is something I think that is absent from Bar-Ron's work, that if they wanted to make the case as convincingly as possible, rather than just saying, I see these letters, this is what I see, take it or leave it, like, this is why I think this is a deliberate mark. Yes, it's wider than the, deliberate marks that make up the rest of the inscription, but, X, Y, Z, right? And I think that's something that can be really quite helpful if you're making a claim like this.
Yeah, and they make a big deal out of, well, I'm dealing with new high-res photos, and I've been working off cast, and they propose some of this, I guess, in a way to try to create a hedge of authority, to say, based on the materials, I'm able to make an analysis that others haven't. I have new photos that aren't released to everyone. They've said they're going to come out later or sometime, who knows. But not dealing with those types of things, because they also don't propose like, or engage with alternate readings to say, well, I'm proposing this reading, which works against historic proposals such as this, and here's why I disagree with them. If you have only read through Bar-Ron's work, you could walk away thinking that this is the first time that anyone is proposing a translation for this at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is just, for someone coming in and thinking, we're not all epigraphers. I think it would be very fun if we're all epigraphers. But since we don't all have that expertise and specialty, how much of a problem for you as you're reading through, like, does that suddenly, what type of shadow does that cast over the rest of the work? Because I know for me, like if we're reading through other texts and you're like, well, you're proposing a reading for this verse from Genesis, and you're not dealing with any of the historical scholarship around this, you're like, well, you can't just do that. But it feels like for some reason when people come to things like sometimes artifacts or inscriptions, we act like we're in the Wild West a little bit. And publicly, it feels like, well, they can make the claim and they're just off to the races. And the academics are in the background. They're like, no, wait. We can't just do that. But off it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's particularly for these inscriptions from Serabit El-Khadim, it's very important to engage with previous scholarship due to the material that they're inscribed on. These are on sandstone, which is a very crumbly material. And there is a very real chance, I'm not aware of with Sinai 357, but there are cases with some of these inscriptions like Sinai 345 that, parts of the rock have actually crumbled away, taken letters with them, or the readings have changed slightly. What can be seen has changed due to deterioration of the material. And in some cases, these were discovered, in the early 20th century. Archaeological standards were not up to the same level as we would expect today. There was some mishandling. I believe Petrie mentions, like they're taking these, no, maybe not Petrie. I think maybe it was the Harvard expedition. But anyway, they mentioned that they're taking these inscriptions to Cairo to put them, in the Cairo Museum. And one of them falls off the camel and breaks in half. So there's
Oops.
this, um, there's another one. I think it might actually be Sinai 361, where we have the early photos. We have the casts that are in the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. There are also some actually in the Catholic University Semitics Library as well. Ludwig Moritz published a volume in 2019 where he actually was able to photograph the original inscription, and part of it is actually missing from the original and could not be located. So looking at these earlier works where you can, like, more of the inscription may be preserved, the state of the inscription, its state of preservation may be a little bit better. Scholars may be able to see more than we can, 120 years later, or 100 years later, or 60 years later, or whatever. It's really important, I think, for these inscriptions in particular to engage with previous scholarship and say, like, maybe I can only see like the faint outline of a letter, but like in this early photo, in the epigraphic description that, say, Albright or Bhutan gives, like, they're more confident. I can actually see more in their old photo than I can see in this new photo.
Yeah. The newer thing isn't always better. Like,
No.
just because you have a new high-res photo, it might be more high-res, but you could be missing material that is essential to the reading that is better preserved in the black and white photo from the 1930s, which also will have its own problems.
Yes, of course.
But is where blending the sources and trying to use all the things can provide us the best reading.
Exactly. And I do want to flag as well this discussion about the high-res photos.
Yeah.
Barone did go to the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East and photograph these casts. Actually, there are, I don't want to toot my own horn here, I also went to the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East in 2013 and photographed these casts, but I didn't use traditional photography. I used what's known as RTI, which I think offers an even better view of the inscription, or views, I should say, than just a high-res static photo. So RTI basically is like you have the camera fixed, looking at whatever the object is, maybe 54 photographs of it, and you've got like a portable flash, and you move it each time to create this sort of virtual dome of light around the object. And then a computer algorithm can like take all of those images and stitch them together in such a way to create this sort of hybrid object where you don't just have those 54 different light angles you took. It can actually sort of interpolate every possible light angle. So it's basically like you're looking at the inscription, you have like, there's no other light, you have a flashlight, and you're just like moving it in a dome, which is super helpful, right? For studying these inscriptions, because like a static image is just one view of the inscription from one light angle, and only being able to see something from one light angle can be misleading, right? Like, a certain light angle, maybe certain parts of the rock will cast shadows that look like letters, or some letters will be in shadow. There are different possibilities that could happen with a static photo, but with RTI, like, you can manipulate the light however you want. You can say like, oh, I can see like this is, actually just like a bump in the rock surface and not a letter. So that's super helpful. It also, lets you do things that you couldn't do with the actual inscription. So like you can remove all of the color data from the photo. So it only has the reflectance data. So it makes it like really shiny and look like a mirror. Obviously not something you could do with the original inscription,
right?
Without being kicked out of a museum, I think. But so you can do that. You can, also make the depth of incised lines, or the perceived depth of different surface features, greater or lesser. You can see like a contour map of the surface using RTI. Like, there are a lot of different things that you can do with RTI that you can't do with a static photograph, and you can't do with the inscription itself. So in some ways, it's almost better than viewing the object in person, because you can do everything you can do looking at the object in person, and things that you like physically can't do.
So we're not here to say that the new developments of technology are all bad or misused, but it's the way you're able to blend these things together is what leads them to be valuable or not. But just having a new piece of tech or a new photo by itself doesn't suddenly permit you to just forego all of the history that's around these. Can I ask too, while we're talking about, I guess, some of the photos and the linguistics on 357, before we move to like 361 and some others, when he sees what he sees as Moses, you have written some about some other, disagreements with letter identifications, and particularly, as you noted earlier, right, that idea of, is it a shin or is it not, and confusions that happen here. Can you say a little bit about is that part there? Because you've said, that the first two maybe, these ones maybe even less so, but even if we want to credit them as being there, would they be what he is saying? Is it that simple? Or are there alternative readings that would still emerge even if it is said that what he's saying is there?
Yeah, so there is still sort of a linguistic problem, even if, these letters were perfectly clear. And this also affects earlier scholars who have looked at the M, Shin, or whatever that letter is sequence in the 5 other inscriptions where it is quite clear. As I mentioned, these inscriptions seem to have more than 22 sounds, more than 22 letters representing more than 22 sounds. And that letter that is often read as a shin, it looks a lot like a shin. It's kind of this like compound bow shape, looks like the later sort of W shin shape. Probably was originally a th sound and not the sh sound. And what would have been the sh sound is that like little triangle shape in Sinai 357. So we've got, and this kind of goes back to what we're talking about, Bar-Ron having to like read these 2 letters as expressing the same sound. They're probably distinct sounds.
Okay.
In the script or in the language behind the inscriptions. So that creates kind of a problem for, identifying these as Moses, particularly if, I think the consensus view of the etymology of Moses is that this is a shortening of an Egyptian name containing the element mes, to be born, so born of some sort of deity that's left off of the name. And we don't really have any examples in other cases of Egyptian being borrowed into a Semitic language of that s sound then being borrowed as a th sound. So if this is a th, as I think seems to be pretty clear, particularly looking at the use of this grapheme in other inscriptions that are have pretty clear readings, where we can be pretty sure about the etymology, that this would be a th originally and not a sh, or not a s. It really complicates the identification of this m th as being Moses.
Mm-hmm. And that, I guess, that complication too of this name not existing just for one individual and only one individual and removed from, is also a part of this too, that, if you're coming from a specific background or tradition where you most clearly identify that name with one figure from a specific text and remove that reading from, again, an Egyptian mining complex that may have connections to, can really shift the way, again, even if you're going to say that what you're saying is there, it's still not as simple as, well, that plus this must mean these things. There are, even if you credit that exists, still additional complications that need to be worked through in order to support and propose those types of claims, like the dating and the context and the geography and the historical background and all of those types of materials that maybe aren't as fun or are the most fun, depending on your perspective. They're the really fun part, but don't make headline fun.
No, they don't.
Could I turn you to, I guess, we spent a lot of time on 357 because it's one that's been getting a lot of attention because of his photo, but you've also mentioned, 361 and the presence of, he goes through a number of readings of other inscriptions. Within those, are there other things that stood out to you that you think have been kind of missed in all of the attention going kind of one direction, that are either surprise benefits that you found within a reading, or, other problems that heighten difficulties with the whole proposal or with readings and specific things?
Um, yeah, I would say, let's see, I think there are definitely a lot of difficulties. There was, I think, one sort of interesting surprise where the sort of extra letters that they were reading sort of prompted me to take a little bit closer look at that part of the inscription. There may be something there. I'm not 100% sure yet. Like, I haven't been able to like parse out if it's just a shadow or if it's like in that case, like they're definitely seeing something.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of like Sinai 357, they're like those two marks, and I don't really see anything else that could
Mm-hmm.
be the rest of those letters. Like that, those I don't really think are there. This one I'm a little bit on the fence about.
Interesting.
Could be interesting to look at that some more. Yeah, and then in terms of difficulties, we can talk about Sinai 361. You know, this also is supposed to have me, Moshe, on it from Moses on it. And I thought this was really interesting. I'll send you a photo of this one as well, so viewers and listeners can look at it compared to his drawing of it or their drawing of it. Again, it's completely blank. There, like I could not find, like there's maybe one stroke of something. It's not kind of the same texture as the deliberate strokes, so I'm not inclined to think it's the remains of a letter. It's on the broken edge of the inscription, but I could not find anything that corresponded to the two mems. Like there maybe like was something that you could potentially read as that shin or the thon, depending on what you think the value of the letter is there, but there really just wasn't very much there to go on, which to me was a bit surprising. And the particularly surprising part about it is Sinai 361 is one of those inscriptions that has M Shin in it. In fact, immediately above where they read Mem Mem Shin from Moses, we just have Mem Shin. So, like, if one wanted to make this argument, you could just use the very clear letters there.
Mm-hmm.
Some previous scholars have done. I think Charles Kramalkov, for example, maybe Douglas Petrovich, I'm not sure. I think that might be the one that he reads as having Moses. But
why? I guess, is it dependent on the reading they want to propose of the other section that leads them to say, well, I can't make that part the from Moses because of the reading I want to propose, so I need to find something new? Because that does feel surprising that if it has been claimed before for this one, and you have them right there, given what you're saying elsewhere, that you wouldn't choose that part, but you're proposing something entirely new.
Yeah, it is very strange. It maybe they want to read, I think, like let us depart or depart immediately before that, Nimosh or something like that. Like we need to get out of here. This is a bad place. Immediately before that, which is, using the mem and the shin there.
Okay.
But I don't see that verb as like especially integral to the argument that these, are the Israelites or anything like that. So I'm not sure. Like
it feels just in line with a lot of the confusing arguments that get proposed and developed through. And I mean, I feel like I have to say here as we wrap up, they have said, this is a proto paper from which they hope to do future study. They're interested in doing more. And so these are all areas that I think are the places where people are calling for, if you want to advance these are things to say more. So they may have more clarifications. They may look to more of these things in the future. We're not saying that this is the last thing they're going to say. It might be, depending on the feedback that they get. They might decide that, okay, there are weaknesses. Only time will tell there. But we felt like it was necessary, given the amount of attention that these have gotten, to come in and bring in a scholar who specializes in these inscriptions and is working currently on something that is dealing with a broader set of these as well, to provide context, because these inscriptions are so fascinating and they are important for our understanding of the development of this system of writing and the transition. Like, these are things that do really matter and should capture people's attention, but maybe not for this reason. So if someone is, leaving the end of this and saying like, okay, well, it doesn't have anything to do with Moses, maybe I don't need to care about it. Why? What would be your like, wait, this is the reason why you should still really care about these inscriptions, the context of them? Like what's still the takeaway that should be the takeaway they had before any of this even started?
Right. Great question. So these are like some of our earliest alphabetic inscriptions, period. And they offer a lot of insight into the early history and potential prehistory, the development, the invention of alphabetic writing. These are, about as close as you can get to the invention of alphabetic writing. And you can glean a lot about, the identity of the inventors, what sort of cultural context they were in from these inscriptions. So, we can look at the forms of the letters. Many of them look like, hieroglyphic or hieratic symbols. So we can be fairly certain that the inventors were in a context where they interacted with Egyptian writing quite a bit. They're in a Semitic language. The letter names are sort of passed down to us, Aleph or Alpha, Beta or Bait. Those things all correspond to, or for the most part, correspond to actual Semitic words that name the pictographs that are used in the early alphabetic inscriptions from Serabit El-Khadim. So like the Beit is a house, right? It is literally a house. The Aleph is the head of an ox, right? Because it is an Aleph. And so from these pictographs, we can be pretty certain that whoever invented the alphabet spoke a Semitic language, that they were inventing this to record a Semitic language, but they're also interacting with, to some degree, Egyptian writing. So that already kind of narrows down the context of this very important invention that, we use every day.
Mm-hmm.
Very important in the history of, the West, also the Muslim world as well. It's very important technology in the history of the world in general. And these are some of our earliest examples of it that provide really important information about how it may have arisen originally.
Can I ask a follow-up here just before we end? Because I do think this is one other point that maybe has led to some confusion, kind of like the script and language distinction. When we're talking about these as having connections to like Semitic languages or Northwest Semitic languages, I do think there's a tendency in people's mind, forwarded by some like Baron and others, to say, okay, well then that must mean that this is connected with Hebrew and with an idea of ancient Israel. But that relationship between that family of languages and an identity group is not so, one-to-one. So can you also say a little bit here of within even, you've talked about connections to the region and people coming down to this. What type of multiplicity of connections could exist between, if we're seeing these as having connections to Semitic or Northwest Semitic language families and peoples in the region that are potential candidates for connections to these types of inscriptions or to the development of this? How do you situate that?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky just because if you take the early alphabetic inscriptions as coming from the 19th or 18th century BCE, we don't really have a lot of comparanda from the Levant or from Syria to know what sort of Semitic languages would have been spoken in that region. I mean, we can be fairly certain, based on late Bronze Age evidence, like Ugarit texts, Amarna Canaanite, things like that, that people were speaking various Northwest Semitic languages in this region. But yeah, as far as being able to identify it with, a particular variety or a particular, group that spoke a particular variety of the language, it's kind of a black box, I think, in terms of figuring out, what would have been present. And that way, I think these texts are quite useful also from a linguistic standpoint, is that they do give us an idea of what, Middle Bronze Age West Semitic of some variety would have looked like. Not a very big view. I mean, these are short fragmentary inscriptions, but they do fill a little bit of a lacuna that exists for this region in terms of its linguistic history.
Well, Dr. Wilson-Wright, thank you so much for taking the time to help unpack some of the background of this and some of the difficulties within recently proposed readings. I really appreciate your time and your insight on this. I am thankful that there are, works coming forward like yours to spend more time with these, because they are so fascinating. So thank you so much for coming to join us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
And if you're looking for some more good reading on this, we will have some links down below to some other articles published by Dr. Wilson-Wright. If you're looking for some more background or some considerations, there's a great one that you wrote on 357 for some more, what should a good scholarly consideration of some of these things look like? I think that can be a helpful comparison if you're looking at one and another. So there's some good reading down below in the description. I'd highly recommend that you check that out. Thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. But for this week, that's all we have. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.